I'm Nicola Talent and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. Freddy Thompson is a really divisive character, isn't he?
Yeah.
Like, he was always, when he was out, before he was locked up for life for the murder of Daithí Douglas, he was either having, he was in with the Kinahans, he was out with them, he was in with Daniel, he was out, he was supposed to be made mow the lawn when he was in trouble, and then he was sort of pushed forward always as the agitator, the one who would suck up all the energy of the media and the police when he was in town, for whatever reason, because of course that's not just because of his personality, that can be done on purpose. But in prison in the last couple of weeks, he's really made a knob of himself, to be honest with you. He's first of all, he smashed up his cell after his mother died, tragically, and then he has been caught with a phone, which he smashed one of the phones off the ground and swallowed a SIM card that he had, and then there was searches ensued of the cells, and they upended the cells and found that he had hidden phones in the back of the television sets, so they all got their televisions taken from them. And he's in that Portlaoise sort of, it sounds like a bit of a cooker, doesn't it?
Sounds like a bit of a pressure cooker. I mean, I think the Portlaoise Prison, obviously, it's always described as Ireland's only high security prison. Mm-hmm. So really, it's the top level of criminals go in there, and they're under a different sort of regime than they would be in the normal prisons. Obviously, it houses then as well the dissident figures as well on a separate wing. Fat Freddie, every time, of course, we mentioned he used to mow Christy Kinahan's lawn. Yeah. Somebody emails or comments on Facebook, that's a load of nonsense or whatever. But I suppose it did always show, like Fat Freddie was the most famous gangland criminal maybe in Ireland at the turn of the century, maybe in the noughties. But he probably wasn't the mastermind. And what really people think of him is that if there was a conflict, a feud, or situation involving violence, Fat Freddie was particularly useful in that circumstance. But in terms of managing a global operation, in terms of drug trafficking and money and all of that, that was not his forte.
No, because wherever was his money? I mean, he's never been subject to a Criminal Assets Bureau investigation. There's no obvious wealth with him except those silly little man bag things that he wears and the Canada Goose coats. Like, I mean, you never really see him in a flash car. Does he drive? Have we ever seen him driving? I think he always had people driving him around.
He always had people driving him around. I don't know if he could drive or not. No, I don't think he ever really managed to, of course you can't be sure, but money seems to have flown in and out of his hands. Unlike, say, his first cousin, Liam Byrne, who certainly amassed a huge amount of wealth, and we've heard that gone through the courts. Fat Freddie described to me once as basically a thug. Yeah, a dangerous person.
I thought you were going to stop on basic. Because I think he is kind of basic.
Yeah, but actually. I mean, obviously he spoke, Do
you know he loves being in the paper?
Does he
loves being on the front page, and he will kind of question if he's not, if someone else makes it to the front page and his story is, within the book.
Back.
Yeah, he kind of just can't understand that, and he gets worked up about that, and he keeps clippings of every time he appears, and it's kind of a sort of a,
yeah, well, look,
it's a simple kind of a mind, is it not? That would.
Well, I mean, he did. Yeah, look, he did speak before about struggling with literacy and various things like that. But obviously with the Kinahans, before the feud, we were hearing, and people were saying it in general, that he was being pushed out of the inner circle, that they'd had enough of him, that that he caused more problems than he solved, and that he couldn't be trusted as they really escalated into being a kind of an international drug trafficking gang. His usefulness as a sort of an enforcer in Dublin had started to drop off. However, he seems to have been brought back into the centre as the feud began, because they needed somebody to coordinate a certain degree of violence on the streets, and to recruit kind of younger men into doing jobs. But now he's serving life. He's appealing at the moment. Some of his appeal was heard in recent times. But as he's gone into prison, that kind of antisocial and aggressive nature seems to be rubbing people up the wrong way.
Strange entry into prison, though, because, of course, there in Portlaoise, and top dog was Brian Rattigan, his arch enemy, the guy who he went to war with back in 2000. Those cocaine wars, I think there was 16 people murdered during that time.
Yeah.
And of course, Rattigan stepped aside and said he had no beef with him. And, he let him into the prison, which I still don't fully understand what went on there. I don't believe they've no beef.
No.
Rattigan's beloved brother, Joey, was murdered at the age of 18.
Yeah.
And Thompson is suspected of being behind that murder. I don't think that ever...
Well, I mean, I
gets
suppose
set aside, does it? The murder of a brother?
I don't know. I mean, I suppose maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I mean, who knows? But it seems.
I think
unlikely.
Rattigan really wanted to get out, didn't he? He wanted his parole, and he wanted to be able to.
Yeah, he wanted to be able to move on and parole and all of those things. And it maybe didn't serve his purpose to carry on a feud in a very sort of confined place. Like Fat Freddie, of course, had been. He had been very close pals with Brian Rattigan back at the turn of the century. We've gone through this before, but in a basic sense, one gang split. They took two sides. It became known as the Crumlin-Drimnagh feud. Fat Freddie was always regarded as the leader of one of those sides. He certainly was orchestrating a lot of the violence, a lot of the threats, a lot of the intimidation that went on, mostly in Dublin's south inner city. He ultimately ended up out in Spain for large periods of time with the Kinahan cartel, and he still really directed a sort of a network of soldiers, really foot soldiers back in Dublin. But you can see over time that really there was people pulling his strings that were far cleverer, far smarter, and while he did have he had a really strong hold, Fat Freddie, over kind of younger guys back in the city. There was, he wasn't the mastermind of this whole operation. And his cousin, Liam Byrne, who managed for a large part of the time to have a much lower public profile, really was a much more important figure in terms of what was coming in and out of the country.
Now, it's his other cousin, Liam Brannigan, who he shares the A wing with in the prison, and that's where they are. And I understand that he actually dobbed the cousin in, said the phones were his when they were caught, and they've seemed to have fallen out now, and Freddie's looking to move.
Yeah.
He's looking to move down to Limerick prison, which, if you speak to anybody within the prison system, will tell you that Limerick is the last place you want to be. It's the worst of the prisons, they say.
Well, I think, in terms of, not necessarily in terms of the violence or whatever, but just it's, I think that higher rates old and maybe less
pretty grim
going on. I mean, Liam Brannigan, of course, that's the accusation people are saying about dobbing in, and you always hear this about various people. Nothing has been proved, but Liam Brannigan is Fat Freddie's first cousin. He's serving a long prison sentence for his role in the attempted hit on
Gary
Hanley. So Liam Brannigan is a curious character, I think, isn't he? I mean, we used to have pictures of him with the Dickie bows and.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
those.
He was also played a key role in the Crumlin-Drimnagh feud. He was always seen maybe as a kind of a sidekick of Fat Freddie Thompson. But he was a more curious character, didn't he? End up back studying archaeology in UCD at one point.
I think he's probably a more intelligent character than his cousin Freddie, and he is probably a slightly, he's probably actually more dangerous and a little bit more sinister.
Yeah.
From what I understand of him, he was better at keeping a lower profile for himself than Freddie ever was. I mean, Thompson just wanted the publicity. He wanted his name in lights, whether that be, along a headline that he was a thug or violent, out of control criminal. It didn't matter to him once he was up there. And he loved the cameras following him and all the rest of it. But they have kind of seemed to have having a fallout there in prison. But as we say, it must be like a pressure cooker living like that. But we'll just have a little look at some of the other blocks, I suppose, in Portlaoise and how Portlaoise is run. So the A block on A2 apparently. So there's A1, A2, and I think Liam Brannigan and Freddie are A1. And in A2, the boss there is Tossie Fox, is that his name?
Tossie Fox. So Tossie Fox would be one of... he was convicted of the murder of Garrett Hutch, which was part of the Hutch-Kinahan feud. Now, Tossie Fox would have been...
Did you ever know who he was before that?
No, I think he was a kind of a lesser light
in
what was described as the new INLA, and that's what we called it too. But really, they were a group of kind of...
childhood neighbour friends, weren't they?
Childhood neighbour friends.
Like Johnny Keogh and Eamon Cumberton and...
Yeah, they were kind of... They were kind of hired gunmen for the Kinahan Cartel, but they weren't part of the inner circle of the Kinahan Cartel. They were in fact kind of non-aligned who ended up on the payroll as part of the feud. Certainly Johnny Keogh had been a member of the INLA at one stage. They seem to have still had a lot of connections with dissidents, but the days of them doing anything for a socialist republic were long gone. They were solely, enforcers for hire. Jared Mackin, of course, also would have been associated. Tossie Fox would have been, really the lesser light in that whole operation. I mean,
so nearly all of those guys are in there together then in Portlaoise now, yeah?
They're nearly all in Portlaoise. There's one of them currently facing trial, so it can't be named, but they're all in there. And Portlaoise, so they'd probably be on a separate wing than the people that are directly regarded as part of the Kinahan Cartel. Although they'd obviously happily associate with each other, they might be regarded slightly differently.
It's amazing that, one person, it is and it isn't, I suppose, that one person comes to prominence and rules the landings and kind of is the boss. I suppose it's like any even friend group, like some more powerful personalities might suggest what's going to happen. And
yeah, I mean, you didn't watch Chimp Empire on Netflix?
I meant to watch it.
It's great.
Tell us about
this.
That's
not to compare people in prison or any human being to chimps, but basically it's just about how it's a documentary about how a group of chimps in the jungle in Uganda, and how they form these hierarchies.
Yeah.
And there's an alpha male, and so these things happen in prisons or happen in life. They happen in... That's not just to say it happens in prisons. It happens in stockbroking firms.
It does. It doesn't mean it's kind of
teams.
It's human nature rather than anything, isn't it?
It's a part of human nature that somebody becomes dominant.
Yes.
Now, obviously, in prison you have a lot of violent criminals, and so the dominance can be more sinister than if you have the head of the local badminton team or whatever.
Who's suggesting?
No,
but it also, funny enough, is to do with what, and Brian Rattigan was absolutely 100% in charge of Portlaoise Prison, but he was also the guy that was getting all the drugs in.
Yeah.
And if you have that supply route,
Yeah.
if you are the one that's kind of getting in the supplies, or you have access to something or other, you become popular, which is a little bit sort of like, anything. Again.
Yeah, but I mean, they have to, the black market trade of drugs and phones in prison is hugely important, in terms of who...
And who controls
that supply, and then they control a degree. As it goes down the line, the addicts ultimately are controlled by the flow of drugs within a prison system, which seems... and it's not really a criticism of the prison service, because it does actually seem almost unstoppable, really.
There's a prison there in Manila that I was in when I was over in the Philippines some years ago.
As a guest,
as a guest, it's really weird. You can walk in off the street have a look, and they're all in cages in the middle of these sort of vast, almost felt like a warehouse or something.
Yeah.
And the stench is overwhelming.
Yeah.
It really is. I've never thought I would see human beings in the conditions they were in. I mean, would be totally contravene our attitudes to human rights and all the rest of it. But anyway, so I'm looking in at this big cage, and it's the men's prison, and there's a door into the women's prison, which is beside, but one of the gang leaders has a key into the women's. Yeah, really, really grim now. But so there's so many of them in this cage that they have to stand up. They
Right.
cannot all sit down at the one time. There isn't room for them. So they stand as if they're on a bus.
Yeah.
And then they get turns sitting down. But of course, it depends on how powerful you are,
Yeah.
whether you get a turn or you don't. And there was this kind of shelf, like almost a mezzanine type of
Yeah.
situation. And up on top of it, I just thought it was where they kept the food or something. And the next thing, this sort of guy's head came out. And he was the boss.
He was the top dog.
He was the top dog. And he got the bed.
Yeah, yeah.
And he always lay down. He never had to stand up.
Right.
Covered in these gang tattoos and everything
Yeah.
like that. It was extraordinary, though, to see it, you know what I mean? And food is passed in through the bars of these prisons by family. They don't get fed.
Nice. So you have to have somebody.
You have to have someone on the outside who passes you in food. And then obviously there are charities, human rights charities, who go along and they pass them in packages of food.
Yeah.
And again, even that is kind of like
Yeah.
survival of the fittest, you know?
Yeah.
Because the poor guys that are standing half the day on the bus, they aren't going to get their fair share.
No.
They'll get the scrap, whatever's left. But that's an aside. In A3 in Portlaoise, the notorious Warren Dumbrell is the top dog.
Yeah, I mean, I think an A3 has a number of.
Who's in there, do you know?
I'm not sure who's in there at the moment, but I think it's some of the more dangerous prisoners that
Right.
are regarded as being particularly volatile, like Warren Dumbrell. I mean, Warren Dumbrell is serving life for the murder of Christopher Cawley, but while he's been in prison, he's been involved in a number of violent incidents. You know, including there was a hostage scenario at one point a long time ago. So he's regarded as being one of the more dangerous criminals. And some of these people are on enhanced regimes where they're you know, they have a much higher degree of security on them. They're not allowed to interact with prisoners in the same way. And Warren Dumbrell will be one of them. He'd be regarded as being probably one of the more volatile people in the prison system. One of, you know, in the really top 10 of the most dangerous prisoners.
A new guy went to school with him.
Yeah,
And he said that he was all right.
yeah.
And then one day he was injured.
Yeah, he suffered a brain injury.
Yeah, you see, he fell off. They used to kind of call it skitting on the back of the Guinness lorries. And they used to run along beside the Guinness lorries and hop on.
Yeah.
But he fell and one of the wheels ran over his head. You know, his head is kind of like peculiar shape.
Yeah.
It's because of that. And this guy said that he completely changed. I mean, you hear people saying all the time, sometimes people get a knock on the head and their personalities change.
I think it's an absolute fact that it can happen,
Yeah.
you know, that if you have a certain, I'm going to get, but like display like
What? Has it happened
dodgy,
to you?
dodgy medical information, but I think the frontal lobe,
Yeah.
if you get an injury there, it kind of, some of that is to do with your, you know, how you know, what you should and shouldn't do, and it can lead to, you know, people having no restrictions in their behaviour, you know.
You know, they used to, back in the kind of the olden days of criminological belief, they used to believe that criminals were purely formed when there was damage at birth to the frontal lobe.
Yeah.
And they used to kind of like go and do studies and see how many of them were, you know, born with forceps births and all that sort of stuff. And then they kind of completely turned that on its head, that it just wasn't the case, that it wasn't a birth defect, basically.
No. I mean, it's not. Look, I mean, but there's no doubt about it. It's just an absolute fact that brain injuries can change personalities. You know.
Yeah, but Warren Dumbrell, and didn't he have a canary or something at one point to and calm him down, and also a kind of a garden, a serene garden, and
yeah, I mean, they do have.
Was given out.
Yeah, I mean, but look, I mean, these people are in prison for a long time.
Yeah,
and I mean, the staff have to work with them.
I don't know how anybody works in that.
No, and
I'd say it must be such a hard job.
But you know, if you go back to Fat Freddie, I mean, he's really proving to be one of the more troublesome prisoners for staff and for inmates alike. And you know, there have been incidents of violence, reports of intimidation of other people. You know, really, some of these people are really, really antisocial and difficult in the prison system.
And he takes drugs, of course, if he can get his hands on them, Freddie. Anything except heroin, plenty of tablets. There was, in recent weeks, there was 3 drug drops caught by the prison officers. They came in over a wall in the exercise yard, which has been the traditional route for many of them. They don't obviously catch everything, but then they realise where they're kind of coming from and they will police that. It's a constant game of... you know, whack-a-mole with the drugs,
absolutely.
isn't it?
I mean, like there was, the amount of ingenuity to try and get drugs over prison walls, drones. When they at one point putting them in pigeons.
Putting them in pigeons?
Well, there was the tennis balls was another one.
Knockbacks and pigeons?
Well, there was some talk of throwing a dead bird in there with the things that the prison service wouldn't instantly look at that as being a drugs drop.
Right.
And there was other things about, I mean, there was all sorts of things
of ways,
reported of that they were putting.
Do you know, I wonder if anyone considered training seagulls. There's probably no seagulls in Portlaoise, is there? It's just when I'm...
Seagulls are untrainable, I think.
They are, but it's just, you always think that our own outdoor area here is a little bit like a prison yard because we have that netting around it to save us from the Dublin 1 seagulls, of course.
who seem to be getting bigger by the year.
They're getting bigger and they're really... but I mean, they definitely, if you could train them, they could carry anything with those massive big feet they have.
A retirement plan, Nicola. Nicola Allen's drug smuggling.
We're going to talk to Chris Summers shortly about a retirement plan for a significant player in the criminal underworld in the UK, and unfortunately it's gone a cropper for him, but anyway, we'll come to that. A4, the sort of the most prominent figure there, is somebody who's facing trials, so we won't go into them. A5, I believe, is the punishment landing, and that's where Freddy Thompson was placed after the phone incident and all the rest of it. Now, C1 is another landing, and Desi O'Hare there is top dog. And I think that Desi O'Hare is one of these model prisoners. He does a lot of yoga. He doesn't watch TV, and that's where the likes of Jim Mansfield Jr. was sent. People who shouldn't necessarily be in the prison system or wouldn't be used to it are often sent to Desi O'Hare's landing because he kind of looks after people, which is really strange given that he's a sort of a self-professed pretty much serial killer.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, like, Desi O'Hare is, the opposite to Fat Freddie in that, he wouldn't be taking drugs, he wouldn't be doing all of that sort of stuff. Like, obviously a huge portion of Portlaoise at one stage was dissident figures. Now, I mean, the number of dissidents or Republican figures back in the day, Provos, INLA, would have made up a huge portion of the population, but that really is getting smaller and smaller all the time. So Desi O'Hare obviously is the INLA,
He was,
but,
he was kicked out of that, wasn't he?
Well, it's a kind of...
It's hard to follow him.
Sometimes they still have a kind of in prisons, they have these as kind of non-aligned, Republican figures, which he'd be sort of regarded as in the prison, He's not fully Republican, but
he was in there many years ago and met up and became a lifelong friend of Eamon Kelly. Yeah. Who went on to mentor a significant character in gangland, including Eamon the Don Dunn and others, and was shot dead himself at the age of 65, having just got his bus pass. Yeah. Anyway, they met in prison and were lifelong friends. I think Desi gave the eulogy at Kelly's funeral, in which he sort of described him as, this sort of son of Ireland. And
I mean, Eamon Kelly would have been... had a lot of Republican connections back in the day. He would have been associated with the official IRA, though never a formal member. So that's what... but I mean, really, in the latter long part of his career, he was a cocaine trafficker, really. The Republican aspect of it was long gone. But because of his association, Eamon Kelly would have been kept with... Desi O'Hare back in the day, you know.
I mean, they definitely were absolute best friends. But anyway, Desi O'Hare is back in prison because of his role in a kidnap and assault of a member of staff at the Mansfield group, Martin Byrne, who remains in witness protection because he gave evidence actually in the case of Jim Mansfield Jr., who was convicted of perverting the course of justice but found not guilty of his role in the kidnap. It was all to do with a takeover bid by different Republican
very murky
protection,
story.
security, and O'Hare and Declan Wacker Duffy were basically caught red-handed in the middle of it, and he's back in prison serving 4 years. In actual fact, he must be nearly coming to the end of that sentence, Desi O'Hare. He lives up in Cady, in Newry, in a house, a little idyllic bungalow with his wife, and he does the gardens, and I think they grow mushrooms out in the back of the place.
And he seems to have been doing a bit of construction work over time, and doing a bit of labouring.
Really religious.
Very religious, absolutely.
Very strange kind of character, but I would say somebody I would absolutely love to interview. I think he is a fascinating character. When he got out of prison initially, do you remember Eamon Dillon, our colleague, actually followed him to Medjugorje, and they found him out. He's big into, is it Padre Pio or somebody like that?
I'm not. You're gonna again.
You know all your criminals and you don't know your saints.
No. Well, he's big into Padre Pio. I mean, if you see, he had a Facebook page.
I bet your mother would be disgusted with you that you don't know who Padre Pio is.
She's fallen off the path of faith as well over the years. But he was a very and he has a very Catholic.
Yeah.
Went
Christian,
to mass
I think.
all
Is he
the
not?
time.
I don't think he's Catholic. I think he's one of
Catholic.
those.
No, I think he's quite. Is he not?
No, I think he's one of those.
Evangelicals.
Kind of are. Is it
they're
born
not
again Christian or? Listen, we better stop here.
Yeah, you better,
we're really going to insult
the
him.
evangelicals tend not to be. They tend not to be into Padre Pio. I have to say, Nicola.
Let's move on. Right. In C3, Padder Keating. Now this must be the real sort of Kinahan cartel wing. C3. Padder Keating, of course, was Thomas Bomber Kavanagh's number 2, who was caught up in a plot to kill James Mago Gately with the Estonian hitman Imre Arakas, and he's serving. Was he convicted of directing a criminal organisation?
He was convicted of some of the on the gangland charge as well as the conspiracy charge. Padder Keating.
He's got a hefty sentence. I was there when he was sentenced, actually, and his wife was there, and they were both very upset. I actually was just listening to the ages of the kids at the time, and I thought, cheapers, he's really going to miss a lot of their lives in prison.
He would be, what we've been told, one of the very much people who call the shots in that prison. That's kind of, that wing there would include a number of people that would have been, I suppose, associated with the Byrne organised crime group, which would have been headed up by Thomas Bobber and Kavanagh, although Kinahan Cartel and these people are happily interact with each other in the prison. It's again slightly different organisation, and that Padder Keating, by all accounts, is definitely one of these people who commands respect in that prison system. Absolutely. And
you know, Keating was the guy who hired the hitman and everyone. You know what I mean? Glenn Clark was under him, was one of his guys. There was somebody else recently, a very chaotic character that Keating had taken on. I was thinking about
Nellie Walsh. I think at some point he was linked to as well.
Yeah. So he was kind of in charge of a lot of those.
Yeah, I mean, he very
people.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, remember that Thomas Bomber Kavanagh had, was part of the Kinahan Cartel, but they had maybe their own franchise in the south and west of the city, where Padder Keating would have really controlled a lot of that operation and been very much his trusted right-hand man.
Now, beside them on C4, which is the second last of the landings we're going to discuss, but on C4, an interesting character called Ali Duran is top dog. Now, he's a an English Turkish guy who was actually caught with our old friend Marcus Sweeney.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh, say that name.
Yeah.
Launched the beast. But anyway, he was caught with him. He was arrested, Duran, as part of a heroin trafficking plot, and obviously Marcus Sweeney was released without charge and has no convictions in relation to drugs.
No. So Ali Duran, he would have been over in Ireland as a contact point for a drugs gang known as the Family. The Family, at this point are probably Ireland's largest, or at least amongst Ireland's largest gangs, as the Kinahan Cartel have receded with their footprint in Ireland. The Family would have been based in West Dublin, and they would have had different supply routes than the Kinahan Cartel. including through England, through Turkish English gangsters, really, particularly moving heroin across mainland Europe from Turkey, from Afghanistan to Turkey, across mainland Europe into the UK and ultimately into Ireland. So he would have, Ali Duran would have been a very much a serious player in that operation, and he was convicted over here after, about £1 million, €1 million euros worth of heroin was seized. But they carry that respect into that prison system.
You'd wonder what else he carries into the prison system, though, that he's become. I suppose we know nothing about his personality or his character, what has kind of seen him rise amongst strangers to the top of the landing area. Has he got control over?
Well, I mean, the family would also be obliged to look after him.
Yeah.
So they'd have associates, obviously, in the prison system. People that, across Ireland, they would have had people that are supplied by them, and they would have then been obliged to say, this is our guy, he's in prison here, Ali Duran, he has to be looked after and treated as one of us, I suppose.
Now, Portlaoise has always been seen as the place, I wonder, like, with the organised criminals are there, do they get the same privileges maybe the old school Republican figures used to get? Like E1, the last of the landings, is where those guys are, and Kevin Brainey would be top dog there.
Yeah, Kevin Brainey,
he's an old school sort of.
Yeah, I mean, he's serving life for his role in the murder of Peter Butterley. He would be part of the new IRA, part of what was the real IRA. Kevin Brainey was regarded as being the head of the Dublin wing of the new IRA. Yeah. He would have been a real IRA figure as that morphed into the new IRA. So they don't get the dissident Republican, the dissident IRA guys still get a different regime than the gangland criminals.
Yeah.
That's an historical thing. Obviously, it happened over a long period of time with the provisional IRA, where they were allowed to organise themselves within the prison. I mean, I think, as far as I know, they still have murals up in IRA murals up in their wing. They're given a degree of more freedom in terms of organising themselves, making decisions, and obviously that sprung out of a horrific campaign of violence that was enacted by the provisional IRA against prison staff, that included murder. So there is still a different regime. Some people have called for that to end. Some people think it's legitimate, but they are, at least informally regarded as political prisoners to a degree. Kevin Brainey would be, certainly a person of respect. There's still a good number of people behind bars for, say, the murder of Peter Butterley, but they're far less IRA guys now, and that decreases almost every year.
There was a security audit in Portlaoise. I'm sure they happen quite frequently in recent months, and of course rumours are abound that there could be an extradition soon. So
yeah, but rumours always abound. Certainly, but yeah, like there's a sense that could be.
Let's say if, for example, some of our friends in Dubai, the Kinahans, if they were brought back here, any of them, because we don't know where they're going, where they're headed for, to do their porridge. But if they were brought back here, it would be Portlaoise where any of them would be incarcerated. Yeah,
you would imagine so.
Yeah.
I mean, you would imagine they'd be straight away brought in there.
Yeah.
And obviously the other thing about Portlaoise would be that it's not just protecting them from other prisoners, it's also making sure that they're not able to operate their criminal organisation from behind bars, which has been
Rattigan.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, but it is a threat that the prison.
I think it's also so it's also for those that might be prone to escaping, because of course Nawaf Al-Fassi, when he was in Portlaoise prison, he was the Dutch Moroccan who was arrested here in a Kinahan safe house. But when he was in prison awaiting extradition to the Netherlands, they had to rush that along because they uncovered a plot to have him broke out of the Portlaoise, and El Rico, the Chilean, had had put together a plan to fly him out of Portlaoise Prison.
Yeah, which is, sounds sort of crazy, I suppose. Yeah. But you've seen it again now in Holland in recent times with Ridwan Taghi. They've uncovered really elaborate plots to try and get him out of prison. None of them have actually been enacted, but they've been stopped before they've happened. And of course, if you have enough energy, resources and motivation, I mean, we've seen what did happen, of course, in Irish prisons during the Troubles. There was major breakouts arranged by the IRA.
Yeah.
Now, it'd be harder these days, there's no doubt about that.
Yeah, it'd be harder, all right, but it's still not. I mean, it was a credible threat because the Dutch military, in actual fact, after they uncovered it, flew in and took him home.
Yeah.
So it was definitely, it's a place of stories, I'm sure, behind those walls in Portlaoise. There's an incredible amount of stories of people, of, terrible things that they've done.
Yeah.
But also human beings who are living what, for them, is a normal life in that jail. Like,
yeah, there's young people who've maybe committed terrible crimes, but, they're in there with people that are, I think, like Freddy Thompson, who have a genuine antisocial sort of streak to them, no matter what. And yeah, it must be. It's not somewhere you want to end up.
It's not somewhere you want to fall out with people, though.
No.
I mean, Freddy, you're right. He probably has an actual antisocial issue.
Yeah.
That he's in prison with his cousin.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that you'd fall out.
Yeah.
And then demand to be moved to the place where everyone says is the last place in the prison system you want to be. But there you go. Some people just don't know how to keep their mouth shut, do they? We're just going to move now to the UK, and we're going to just talk to Chris Summers about the passport story, which of course 3 men have been jailed there in relation to providing passports to some of the criminals, the likes of who we've been talking about, and in particular to Christy Kinahan. So Chris, the case against the 2 men who were basically supplying these false passports to Christy Kinahan and other criminals, was that heard? Was it in the Old Bailey?
No, for some reason it was at Reading Crown Court, which is, just west of London. So I'm not quite sure why they chose to put it there, but it got a lot less sort of media coverage than it might otherwise have done, I guess.
So what happened yesterday, Chris, at the sentencing?
Okay, so there had been a trial which started in January. On the first day of the trial, Anthony Beard pleaded guilty. So he was taken away, and the 2 co-defendants, Christopher Zetek and Alan Thompson, went on trial. They were found guilty, and yesterday all 3 of them were sentenced for basically complicated charges, but basically making these fraudulently obtained genuine passports, and the more important charge, which is perverting the course of justice, because obviously by doing that they were allowing criminals to sort of stay on the run and avoid justice for a bit, for a time.
So what details were heard during the course of the trial about them and how they got their hands on these passports and how they got them into the hands of the likes of Christy Kinahan?
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting because when the judge sentenced them, he described it as a professional and skilled operation. But it was, when you hear how they did it, it's not really rocket science. I mean, they had a clientele of customers, of gangsters who and people facing murder charges who needed they needed a passport with a new identity so that they could get out of the country or move across borders. People like Christy Kinahan, but a lot of Scottish gangsters, Christopher Hughes, James and Barry Gillespie, who are quite well-known villains in Scotland. So what they did, they basically they recruited a bunch of basically alcoholics and drug addicts and people who really are not going to need a passport themselves and were happy to donate their identity for a small sum of money, and then they would apply in that person's name, under their name, their address, and the only thing they would change is the photograph. So they get a photograph, a passport photograph of the actual sort of criminal customer who wanted a new passport, and they would switch it, and they would get other people to sign the back of it saying, "This is Christopher Hughes or whatever." Sorry, this is Fred Bloggs, the actual
Yeah.
identity
Pseudonym, yeah.
donor. And it worked, incredibly easy. The passport office just approved these passports, and as the judge said, once they were authorized, they were absolutely faultless. You're never going to get stopped at a border.
I mean, they seem to have had an incredible level of contacts with some of the most major league criminals across the UK and Ireland. I think they were charging up to 15,000, were they, for these passports? But some of the names included, for example, Michael Moogan, he was also extradited from Dubai for major league drug trafficking. So they Anthony Beard and Christopher Zetek, they seem to have really had a heavy level of criminal contacts.
Yeah, and that guy, Christopher Hughes, from memory, wasn't he charged or convicted in relation to the murder of the Dutch blogger Martin Koch, who was shot dead after he came out of a nightclub sometime after the Kinahan Hutch feud had begun.
Yeah.
He was a kind of a peculiar character, a sort of a citizen journalist who was writing about Ridwan Taji and sort of, the internal workings of his operation.
Yeah, he
and
was
Christopher Hughes was from Scotland, I think, and was flown over to the Netherlands. He was set up and shot.
Yeah, that's right. There was a conduit between Zetek, whose real name is Christopher McCormack. He's a well-known London villain who used to work for the Addams family, notorious London gang. He was like an enforcer for them. So he obviously had a lot of connections, and the trial heard that he had an EncroChat phone, and it was that through which he would communicate with all these Scottish gangsters. So they would basically tell him, "Oh, we need a passport for this guy." Some of them would, one of them actually came down to London to discuss his passport, but most of them they'd meet them in sort of places like Spain and Italy where they were sort of hiding out, and then hand over these passports.
So it was kind of like a retirement number for the enforcers of an earlier day, was it?
Yeah, it did almost seem like that. It was a nice little learner where he was he's 67, so he's maybe a bit too old to do armed robberies and whatever, which apparently he had. He was one of the best sort of armed robbers in the country at one point. And then an enforcer, maybe 67-year-olds don't go around enforcing for gangland families. But yes, he still had the contacts, and he thought, okay, yeah, I know Anthony Beard was this guy who'd been doing this for 20 years. He knew exactly how to play the system. And the two of them teamed up. One had the contacts for the customers, the other one knew how to do it. So for a while, it worked really well, and they were making a lot of money.
Now, the Irish wing of the Kinahan operation were previously found here to be running a similar.
Yeah, there was a guy who's just come through the courts in recent months. He described himself as suffering from addiction problems. He was living up in County Louth, and his name and identity was used by Daniel Kinahan to get him a passport. I mean, it was the same sort of thing. He said he was approached by a third party. He took a sum of money, never met Daniel Kinahan, had the Gardaí agreed that he had no connections with the gang, but he was basically a down on his luck type, and he got paid a flat fee through this third party, and Daniel Kinahan then used his passport and moved across Europe during the height of the feud. So it does seem, as you said yourself, it doesn't seem that you need to be a criminal mastermind to do this. I wonder, is it something that is stoppable with the new wave of passports that are going to come?
Yeah, well, I mean, I did ask that question. I mean, I tried to get an answer from the Home Office, who represent the passport office, about what they've done what sort of added layers of security they've done to sort of stop this happening. And they basically didn't answer. They came back with a sort of a statement about this case particular and how, you know, we worked with a National Crime Agency to get these guys convicted, but they didn't actually answer the question. So
No,
you
because
wonder whether
you,
it's impossible to stop unless they use some sort of facial recognition software. Because you know, obviously the difference was that they were, I mean, some of these people were renewing their passports. They deliberately sort of chose people who looked a little bit like the actual guy who needed a passport, but they were very different looking, you know. And facial recognition software would obviously say that's not the same person. So you wonder whether they're using that and they just don't want people to know that. But otherwise, yeah, this really very difficult to stop this as long as you can find people willing to donate their identity and other people willing to, you know, lie and say that is that person. Then it seems almost impossible to stop.
and was there any details given about Christopher Zetek or McCormack? Like, he did seem to spend a lot of time in Ireland as well. It was said, I think, in the sentencing hearing.
Yeah, they said that he spent most of his time sort of between, well, in Spain, you know, during the lockdown. When the lockdown happened, he went to live in Spain for about 18 months. So I think probably when he was in Spain, he probably had a lot of contacts with Irish gangsters and other villains. But yes, he had a lot of connections. You know, knew a lot of these Scottish guys, and obviously he's been in the underworld in London for years. So he he probably has a very stocked contacts book of who's who of crime.
I presume, Chris, that the sentences reflected the previous convictions of the trio and, you know, possibly the two, obviously, who didn't plead got a lengthier sentence because they forced a court case to be heard.
Yeah, I was quite surprised the sentences weren't longer because I remember a case quite a few years ago, a Liverpool gangster called Johnny Hass, who he was given 22 years for perverting the course of justice. Um, I mean, that was a bizarre case, but that was maybe the extreme lengths of it. But yeah, 8 years for Zetek didn't seem that long, really, considering, you know, what he was doing was allowing murderers and very heavy duty criminals to stay on the run. The other guy, Beard, got a 15% discount for a guilty plea, so he got basically sort of 6.5 years. And Thompson got 3 years because he was a very, you know, small player.
Right.
All of them have got, you know, quite serious health issues. I think Zetek has got prostate cancer. Beard, who amazingly, if you look at the photograph of him, you would not believe he's 61 years old. He looks at least 70.
Yeah.
He's apparently a chronic alcoholic. So
Right.
that the booze has not been kind to him. But yes, you wonder whether
And in the
even though
UK, usually when there's a sentencing, they will serve half and the other half on licence. So you can
yeah, that's right. They're only going to serve half of those sentences as well. So
And a proceeds of
yeah.
crime case often follows a conviction in the UK when they have to detail all their assets. Was there any suggestion of that, or do any of them appear to have, after some of them their lengthy criminal careers, have they managed
Yes,
to
I think
collect anything?
Zetek is the one they would be going for the money. I don't think Beard has much money left. If you know, whatever money he was making out of it, I think he sort of drank it. And Thompson got very little. So yeah, Zetek is the one who might have some assets that they will be going for. And
All right.
there was mention of proceeds of crime hearings.
Hearings. Okay. Okay, Chris Summers, thank you very much.